Welcome, Seeker.
The desert does not easily give up its secrets. And yet, in 1945, near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, the sands shifted to reveal something extraordinary. 13 ancient codices sealed in clay jars, hidden for over 1,500 years. Within those brittle pages lay writings that challenged the very foundations of Christianity, texts that whispered of divine mysteries, long buried beneath the weight of orthodox dogma. Why were these writings hidden? Why did those who safeguarded them risk everything to ensure they would not be destroyed? And most importantly, what truth did they carry that made them so dangerous? The Nag Hammadi Library is not just a discovery of forgotten scriptures. It is a window into a spiritual world that nearly vanished from history. Inside, we find Gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, and Mary Magdalene, voices silenced by the emerging church as it consolidated its power. We encounter teachings that describe the soul's journey through layers of existence, visions of the divine that portray not one God of order, but a cosmos shaped by flawed rulers and hidden realities. These are not idle stories. They are maps of consciousness, visions of awakening, and guides to liberation. They tell us that the kingdom of heaven is not a place to wait for after death. It is a state hidden within us, waiting to be unveiled. They describe a Christ who is not merely an external savior, but the spark of divine light already burning in each human being. But imagine for a moment how threatening such ideas would have been to a church building its authority. If salvation is not granted by institution or priest, but found in one's own direct experience of the divine, what becomes of hierarchy, ritual, and control? If truth resides within, why would anyone kneel before earthly power? It is no wonder, then, that these texts were branded heretical, condemned as dangerous whispers of rebellion. They were hunted, burned, and nearly erased from memory. And yet, through fate, or perhaps design, some survived. Hidden away in the desert silence, they endured until a time when humanity was ready to rediscover them. In this video, we will journey into the heart of the Nag Hammadi texts. We will uncover the historical currents that forced them underground, explore the philosophical and mystical treasures they contain, and reflect on why their message resonates so strongly today. Was it mere chance that they remained hidden until the modern world? Or was it part of a greater unfolding, a cycle in which forbidden wisdom waits patiently until seekers are prepared to hear it once more? Stay with me as we enter this labyrinth of forgotten knowledge. For what you are about to discover may not only change how you view history, but how you understand yourself, the cosmos, and the hidden dimensions of truth. And if you wish to walk further into these mysteries, subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and keep your curiosity alive. For curiosity is the first breath of awakening. To understand why the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden, we must step back into one of the most turbulent moments in human history, the birth of Christianity as both a spiritual movement and a political power. The first centuries after Christ's life were not unified, nor were they simple. There was no single Christianity, but many Christianities. Communities across the Mediterranean each carried their own visions of the divine. Some worshipped Christ as God incarnate. Others revered him as a teacher of hidden wisdom. Some emphasized faith. Others sought direct knowledge, gnosis. This word gnosis is the key. It means not belief, but direct experience. The Gnostics, as they came to be called, were less interested in obedience to dogma and more in awakening the divine spark within. They taught that the material world, with all its suffering and corruption, was the work of flawed cosmic rulers, archons, beings who sought to keep humanity ignorant of its true origin. Above them stood the ultimate, ineffable source, often called the monad, a reality beyond all names and forms. For the Gnostics, Christ did not come merely to die for humanity's sins, but to remind us of our forgotten origin, to awaken us to the truth that each soul is a fragment of that divine source. temporarily trapped in the world of matter. Salvation, then, was not submission to authority, but remembering who you truly are. Now pause for a moment and consider. What happens when such teachings spread in a world where empires thrive on hierarchy, obedience, and control? The early centuries of Christianity were filled with conflict, not only with Rome, but within its own body of believers. Bishops and leaders began to consolidate authority, weaving together an orthodox faith that could unify the scattered followers of Christ. This meant drawing sharp lines, deciding which gospels were true and which were false, which teachings were to be preserved and which condemned. It was in this process that the Gnostic writings, like those found at Nag Hammadi, were declared heretical. By the time of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a persecuted faith, but the rising spiritual backbone of empire. To support this new political role, the Church required uniformity, not diversity. Belief, not inner revelation, was to be the foundation of faith. And so, councils were convened, scriptures were selected, certain gospels were elevated, others silenced. By the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the blueprint of Orthodox Christianity was being drawn, and with it came the suppression of alternative voices. Imagine being a community that cherished the Gospel of Thomas, a text that says, "The kingdom of God is within you, and all around you, not in buildings of wood and stone." Such words cut directly against the rising authority of a church that demanded loyalty to its bishops, its rituals, its structures. The Gospel of Mary portrays Mary Magdalene not as a peripheral figure, but as a disciple of profound spiritual insight, one whose teachings the male apostles could not fully grasp. This, too, was dangerous, for it undermined patriarchal structures being enshrined in the growing institution. The Gospel of Philip speaks of union, mystery, and sacred knowledge of the heart, teachings that could not be controlled by ritual or law. For the custodians of orthodoxy, these were threats, not treasures. And so, they were condemned, banned, and hunted. But those who loved them did not simply surrender. Some chose to preserve them, not openly, but in silence. This is the world into which the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden. Likely sealed in jars by monks or believers in Upper Egypt, they were buried not to be forgotten, but to be protected. These texts were not abandoned. They were entrusted to time itself. Philosophically, this concealment carries its own symbolism. Hidden knowledge, like a seed in the earth, waits for the right season to emerge. To the Gnostic mind, nothing in the cosmos is accidental. What is buried is not lost, it is transformed. What is hidden from the unready is preserved for the seeker. And so, their burial can be seen as an act of faith, a trust that the wisdom of Gnosis would one day return, when humanity could once again listen. This interplay between concealment and revelation mirrors the very heart of Gnostic thought. The cosmos itself was, to them, a grand concealment, a veil cast over the true source. Just as the divine spark lies hidden within the soul, waiting to awaken, so too did these texts lie hidden beneath the sands, waiting to be uncovered. When they finally re-emerged in 1945, they arrived in a world dramatically different from the one that suppressed them. A world in which traditional religious structures were losing their hold, and seekers once again turned inward for truth. It was as if the texts had waited patiently for humanity to reach a new threshold of questioning. Thus, the historical story is only half the tale. The other half is philosophical, even mystical. The very act of concealment was itself part of their destiny. For the Gnostics, time is not linear but cyclical. Wisdom disappears, only to return in a new age. The hidden is revealed precisely when the seeker is ready. The Nag Hammadi texts, then, are not just fragments of a forgotten past. They are living symbols of the eternal dance between suppression and revelation, between ignorance and awakening. To understand why the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden, we must look beyond the history of councils, bishops, and empires, and step into the radical vision that these writings carried. For in their pages lies a cosmology so different from what became Orthodox Christianity that it could not coexist with the rising church. The Gnostic worldview begins with a paradox, that the universe we see, touch, and live within is not the true home of the soul. The world, for the Gnostics, was not the perfect creation of a benevolent God, but rather the distorted work of lesser powers. These beings, called archons, a Greek word meaning rulers, were cosmic gatekeepers who governed the material realm. They were not ultimate gods, but ignorant architects, shaping matter in their own flawed image. Behind them stood the demiurge, a blind and arrogant craftsman who mistakenly believed himself to be the highest deity. For the Orthodox Church, such an idea was intolerable. The Genesis story of creation was sacred. God looked upon the world and declared it good. To suggest that the world was instead a prison, that its rulers were deceivers, was to invert the entire foundation of Judeo-Christian thought. And yet, to the Gnostics, this was not blasphemy. It was revelation. They believed that each human carried within them a fragment of something far greater, a spark of divine light from the realm beyond the demiurge, beyond the archons, beyond all matter. This was the true origin of the soul, not of earth, but of the eternal fullness, the pleroma. The great tragedy, they said, is that humanity has forgotten this. Like a dreamer lost in illusion, the soul wanders the world of matter believing it to be the only reality. We build empires, wage wars, chase wealth, all while asleep to our true nature. Here's where Christ enters their story, not as a sacrificial victim whose blood redeems humanity, but as a revealer of truth. In many of the Nag Hammadi writings, Jesus is depicted as a bringer of hidden knowledge, a teacher who whispers the secrets of the cosmos to his disciples. Consider the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Christ. Unlike the canonical Gospels, it contains no miracles, no passion narrative, no resurrection story. Instead, it begins with a promise. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. This is a radically different vision of salvation. It is not about external rituals or adherence to dogma, but about inner awakening. Death, to the Gnostic, is not merely the end of the body, but the ignorance of one's true self. To not taste death is to awaken before leaving the body, to see the truth of one's divine origin, even while still walking the earth. Another Nag Hammadi text, the Gospel of Philip, speaks of union and mystery. You saw the Spirit, you became Spirit. You saw Christ, you became Christ. You saw the Father, you shall become the Father. Such words blur the lines between human and divine. They suggest that salvation is not merely granted from above, but arises from within, that the human soul itself is capable of becoming one with the divine source. For a church seeking to establish authority, such teachings were a dangerous fire. If each person carries within them the potential for direct communion with the divine, what need is there for priests, bishops, or structures of power? If Christ's message was not about obedience, but about self-realization, then the entire edifice of ecclesiastical authority begins to tremble. But the challenge went deeper still. Gnostic texts often elevated voices that the Orthodox tradition diminished. In the Gospel of Mary, it is Mary Magdalene who receives visions and secret teachings from Christ, teachings that the male apostles struggle to accept. In this story, Mary stands as a spiritual equal, even superior to Peter, the figure who would later symbolize the foundation of the church. Imagine the implications. A woman, not a man, as the bearer of the deepest truth. In a world increasingly defined by patriarchal hierarchies, such a vision was intolerable. The Gnostic path was not one of external conformity, but of inner transformation. Their rituals, when they existed, were not rigid dogmas, but symbolic enactments of awakening. The bridal chamber, for example, spoken of in the Gospel of Philip, was not a literal marriage, but a mystical union of the soul with its divine counterpart, a restoration of wholeness long lost. To the Orthodox mind, this was chaos, too fluid, too mystical, too uncontainable. Where they sought order, canon, and creed, the Gnostics sought experience, vision, and mystery. This is why the Nag Hammadi texts had to be hidden, not simply because they disagreed with church leaders, but because they offered an entirely different map of reality, one in which the church's role as gatekeeper was unnecessary. Imagine holding such a text in the 4th century. To possess the Gospel of Thomas was to carry a forbidden key to freedom. To read the Gospel of Mary was to defy the rising patriarchal structure. To speak of archons and the demiurge was to undermine the narrative of a good and ordered creation. And so, the decision was made not to destroy, but to preserve. To place these books in clay jars and bury them in the earth, as if planting seeds for a future harvest. For those who hid them must have known that truth cannot be erased, it can only be delayed. If the previous section revealed the outer challenge, and Nag Hammadi texts posed to the early church, their theology, their defiance of hierarchy, their radical reinterpretation of Christ, then in this section draws us deeper into the very heart of their vision. For the Gnostic writings were never meant to be just speculative philosophy. They were maps of the soul's journey, guiding the seeker through the labyrinth of existence toward the light of liberation. At the center of this vision lies a profound question. What is the true nature of reality? The canonical Christian tradition insists upon a clear, linear narrative. God creates the world, humanity falls, Christ redeems, and salvation is achieved. But the Nag Hammadi texts whisper something more paradoxical, that the world we see is a kind of dream, woven by powers that themselves do not fully understand the source. Take, for instance, the hypostasis of the archons, a text found among the Nag Hammadi library. It retells the Genesis story, but through an inverted lens. Here, the rulers, the archons, shape Adam, but they cannot bring him to life until a higher spark descends into him. Humanity, in this vision, is not merely the clay of earth, but the vessel of a divine essence that the rulers themselves could never create. The true mystery is that the soul is older, higher, and more radiant than the cosmos itself. This flips the entire worldview of antiquity upside down. For if the soul is not the creation of the cosmos, but the cosmos is instead the prison of the soul, then every act of awakening is an act of rebellion. Every flash of gnosis, of direct knowing, tears open the illusion, woven by the archons. And here lies the deeper reason these texts were suppressed. It was not only theology, it was power. A society built on obedience, hierarchy, and order cannot tolerate a message that says, "You are already divine. You need only remember." Let us pause on this word, gnosis. It does not mean intellectual knowledge, like reading or reciting doctrines. It is inner recognition, a remembering of something the soul has always known. It is the spark recognizing its origin in the pleroma, the boundless fullness of the divine. Imagine the implications for the seeker. A priest can baptize your body. A church can legislate your conduct. But only gnosis can awaken your soul. And gnosis is beyond control. It strikes like lightning, unpredictable, uncontainable, arising from within. The texts often describe this moment of awakening in symbolic language. The Gospel of Truth speaks of the soul as one who wanders in forgetfulness until hearing the call of the divine. It is like a dreamer being startled awake, realizing that the shadows and phantoms were never real. Salvation, in this sense, is not a gift bestowed from outside. It is the unveiling of what was always true. Other writings, like the Tripartite Tractate, use the metaphor of light breaking into darkness, reminding the soul of its own radiance. Again and again, the theme repeats. The world is a veil, a deception, and the task of the seeker is to pierce it. This is where the archons play their role. They are not demons in the simple sense, but forces of ignorance, conformity, and distraction. They bind the soul to the world through fear, desire, and illusion. They whisper that power, wealth, and authority are the highest goods. They keep humanity turning in circles, asleep to its own origins. But the Gnostic writings insist the archons have no power over the awakened. Once the soul remembers its divine spark, the prison bars dissolve. This cosmic drama becomes even more striking when viewed through the figure of Christ. In the Nag Hammadi texts, Christ is often portrayed not as the suffering victim, but as the luminous revealer. He enters the material world not to sacrifice, but to awaken. He exposes the archons, unmasks the demiurge, and points the way beyond illusion. In the Apocryphon of John, one of the most famous texts of Nag Hammadi, Christ appears to John after the resurrection, not in flesh and blood, but as radiant light. He explains the origin of the cosmos, the fall of Sophia, wisdom, and the rise of the demiurge. He reveals the truth hidden behind appearances, that Sophia's divine spark entered the material world, and it is through awakening that her children, humanity, may return to the fullness. What is striking here is not only the theology, but the intimacy of it. The Christ of the Nag Hammadi texts is not a distant judge, but a teacher of mysteries, speaking directly to the soul. He does not demand blind faith, but invites inner recognition. Such a vision was revolutionary. It suggested that every individual could become a knower, a seer, a mystic. That salvation was not mediated through institutions, but discovered in silence, contemplation, and direct experience. No wonder, then, that these writings were considered dangerous. To a world increasingly shaped by imperial Christianity, with its bishops, creeds, and laws, the Gnostic message was a spark that could ignite the fire of independence. But here is the paradox. What was suppressed in one age can be revealed in another. The monks or seekers who buried the Nag Hammadi texts may have sensed this. They entrusted them not to time's destruction, but to time's rediscovery. And so, we find ourselves today with their words once again before us. The Gnostics remind us that the world we see is not the whole of reality, that within us burns a light older than the stars, and that awakening is possible even now, even here. The texts whisper across the centuries, "Do not be deceived by appearances. You are more than flesh. You are more than history. You are a spark of the divine, clothed in matter, awaiting remembrance." This, above all, is why the Nag Hammadi texts were hidden, not only because of the power structures of history, but because they carried a fire meant only for those who dared to seek. A fire too dangerous for kings, too uncontrollable for priests, too liberating for empires. Yet the fire endures. And in every age, there are those who rediscover it. If this mystery speaks to you, let your voice be heard. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. The Nag Hammadi writings are not merely relics of an ancient conflict, nor just curiosities for historians to ponder. Their power lies in how they continue to speak across time, to us, now, in this very moment. For the Gnostics believed that truth is never confined to books or locked away in temples. It lives wherever a soul dares to awaken. So how might we, in our fragmented and noisy modern age, draw wisdom from these texts that were hidden for centuries? First, they teach us to question appearances. The Gnostics warn that the world is filled with illusions, crafted by powers that feed on ignorance. Today, those illusions may not wear the name of archons, but they take many forms: endless distraction, consumerism that tells us we are never enough, voices of authority insisting what to believe without allowing us to discover for ourselves. The Gnostic impulse invites us to pause, to look beneath the surface, and to ask, What is real? What is true? This questioning does not mean rejecting the world with bitterness, but seeing it with clarity. The Gnostic remembers that what is deepest cannot be bought, controlled, or legislated. It is the spark of awareness itself. Second, the texts invite us to turn inward. The Gnostics insisted that divine knowledge was not external. It was buried in the heart. Meditation, contemplation, silence. These are not just spiritual techniques, but doorways into gnosis. When the mind grows quiet, the soul begins to remember. In that remembering, we feel the faint shimmer of something eternal within us, a presence untouched by the chaos of the world. Third, they remind us of the power of myth. For the Gnostics, stories of Sophia, of the demiurge, of the archons, were not literal in the way dogma is literal. They were maps of inner reality. The fall of Sophia could be seen as the soul's descent into forgetfulness. The tyranny of the demiurge could be recognized in the oppressive voices within our own psyche. And the revelation of Christ was not only history, but a symbol of the inner awakening that each of us must undergo. By reading these myths symbolically, we learn to see our own lives mirrored in their cosmic dramas. Every struggle with ignorance, every moment of clarity, every flash of insight becomes part of the great story of return. Fourth, the Nag Hammadi texts carry a radical message of inner freedom. They tell us, no matter how heavy the world may feel, no matter how powerful the archons appear, the soul is never truly bound. The bars of the prison are made of illusion. To awaken is to see through them. This is not a call to reject society, but to live in it without being enslaved by it. The awakened one walks through the world with a kind of serene independence, no longer a captive of fear or manipulation. And finally, the Gnostic message is a reminder of hope. If those seekers of old dared to bury their books in the sand, trusting that a future age would uncover them, then perhaps we too can trust that the light is never extinguished. The divine spark cannot be buried forever. It waits, patient, indestructible, within each of us. In this way, the Nag Hammadi texts offer not only a glimpse into the struggles of an ancient age, but a mirror for our own. They whisper across the centuries, "Do not forget who you are. Do not bow to the illusions of the archons. Seek the spark within, and you will find your way home." If this journey through hidden wisdom resonates with you, remember to subscribe and leave a comment below. Your thoughts help us weave this sacred web of seekers and truth seekers alike. For centuries, the sands of Egypt guarded a secret. The clay jars at Nag Hammadi held not only forgotten manuscripts, but the echo of a revolution of the spirit. They preserved a vision of humanity that dared to defy the powers of its age, one that declared the spark of the divine was not reserved for priests or kings, but burned in the heart of every soul. This is why the texts were hidden, because they were dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of weapons or armies, but in something far more threatening. They offered freedom of the mind. They whispered that no priest, no emperor, no worldly authority could stand between you and the divine. And such an idea, to those who rule, is intolerable. But the truth cannot be buried forever. When those manuscripts were unearthed in 1945, it was as though an ancient voice spoke again, reminding us that the human spirit cannot be silenced. What the rulers of the past sought to hide, destiny has returned to light. So the question now passes to us. What will we do with this hidden knowledge? Will we let it remain a curiosity of scholars, or will we breathe life into its message, allowing it to challenge us, to awaken us, to free us from the illusions of our own age? Perhaps this is the greatest gift of the Nag Hammadi texts, not simply that they survived, but that they confront us with a choice. Will we continue to walk in the shadows of forgetfulness, or dare to claim the light of gnosis for ourselves? The Gnostics believed that awakening begins the moment you question the world around you, the moment you refuse to accept appearances as truth. And if you have listened this far, and perhaps that same spark has already been kindled within you. The sands of time preserve these words for us. And now, like a torch passed across generations, their flame rests in your hands. The question is, will you let it burn? If this exploration stirred something within you, I invite you to continue walking with me through the labyrinth of hidden wisdom. Subscribe to the channel, share your reflections in the comments, and join the circle of seekers keeping this flame alive. For in our search together, we honor the courage of those who hid the texts and ensure their secrets are never silenced again.